Have you ever heard of a time when a city at the peak of its power was brought to its knees, not by swords and spears, but by an invisible enemy? Let's travel back in time, over 2,000 years ago, to ancient Greece. We're talking about Athens, the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and art. A city that gave us Socrates, Plato, and magnificent buildings like the Parthenon. But in the 5th century BCE, this shining beacon of civilization faced one of its darkest hours. This wasn't just any conflict. It was the Peloponnesian War. And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Athens and its allies were locked in a massive struggle against Sparta and its league. Imagine the scene. Athens, a bustling metropolis, suddenly becomes a fortress. The legendary statesman Pericles had a strategy. He gathered everyone from the surrounding countryside, the region known as Attica, inside the city's massive walls. The idea was to use Athens' powerful navy to supply the city and attack Sparta's coast while avoiding a direct land battle with the fearsome Spartan army. It sounded like a solid plan. The walls were strong, and the port of Piraeus was their lifeline to the sea. But this strategy had an unforeseen and catastrophic consequence. The city, designed for a certain number of people, was suddenly overflowing. Tens of thousands of refugees poured in, setting up makeshift camps in temples, public squares, and any open space they could find. The population swelled to a size it had never experienced before. Living conditions, which were already not what we'd call sanitary today, became dangerously crowded. And it was in this crowded, stressed, and confined environment that the nightmare began. In the year 430 BCE, just 1 year into the war, a mysterious and terrifying illness arrived. It came through the port of Piraeus, the very lifeline that was supposed to save them. The disease spread like wildfire through the packed city. This was the infamous plague of Athens. We know about this in such vivid detail, thanks to one man. He was an Athenian general, an historian who lived through it, caught the plague himself, and miraculously survived to write about it. His account is one of the earliest, most detailed descriptions of an epidemic in Western history. According to Thucydides, it started suddenly. People who were perfectly healthy would all at once feel an intense heat in their heads. Their eyes would become red and inflamed. Inside, their throats and tongues turned bloody, and their breath became unnatural and foul. This was just the beginning. Soon came sneezing and hoarseness, followed by a violent cough. The sickness then settled in the stomach, causing retching and vomiting of every kind of bile. Most victims suffered from agonizing but ineffective dry heaves. On the outside, their bodies weren't overly hot to the touch, but they were reddish and covered in small blisters and sores. The internal burning, however, was so intense that people couldn't bear to wear any clothing. They longed to be in cold water, and many who weren't being cared for threw themselves into cisterns, driven mad by an unquenchable thirst. And it made no difference whether they drank a little or a lot. The torment was the same. On top of all this, a dreadful restlessness and the inability to sleep wore them down completely. For about 7 or 8 days, the internal fever raged. If they survived that long, the disease would move down into the bowels, causing severe ulcers and a violent diarrhea that often proved fatal due to exhaustion. Thucydides observed that the plague seemed to attack from the head downwards, settling in every part of the body. Even those who survived were often marked for life. The disease could settle in their extremities, causing them to lose fingers and toes. Some were blinded. Others lost their memories entirely, waking up not knowing who they were or recognizing their loved ones. The sheer unpredictability of it was terrifying. No one knew what caused it, and no known medicine worked. What helped one person might harm another. It struck everyone, regardless of their physical strength or constitution. Doctors were among the first and most frequent casualties, as they were in constant contact with the sick. The helplessness was absolute. Prayers in the temples and consultations with oracles were all in vain. Eventually, people just gave up on them. The most terrible thing of all, Tosadide writes, was the despair. When someone felt themselves getting sick, they would immediately fall into a state of hopelessness, which made them give up and lose any will to fight back. The sight of others dying all around them was psychologically crushing. People were dying alone in their homes. The streets were filled with the dead and dying. Bodies were left where they fell, a constant, grim reminder of the plague's power. The social fabric of Athens began to unravel. The old customs and laws regarding burials were abandoned. With so many deaths, people didn't know what to do. They would pile bodies onto funeral pyres that were meant for others, or sometimes just toss a body onto a pyre that was already burning and walk away. The city's sanitation system, if you could call it that, completely collapsed. This breakdown wasn't just physical, it was moral. As the fear of death hung over everyone, a sense of lawlessness took hold. People figured they might die tomorrow, so why not enjoy today? They started spending their money lavishly and indulging in pleasures they would have previously hidden. The fear of the gods and the laws of man lost their meaning. No one expected to live long enough to be brought to justice for any crime. It was a race to get as much enjoyment out of life as possible before the inevitable end. This was a complete societal collapse, driven by a microscopic force. The plague raged for 2 years, then subsided only to return for another year in 427 BCE by the time it was over. It's estimated that it had wiped out between a quarter and a third of the Athenian population. That's a staggering number. Imagine a city losing 1 out of every 3 people. The army and the navy were decimated. Among the dead was Athens' great leader, Pericles himself. He lost his sister and both of his legitimate sons to the plague before succumbing to it. His death left a power vacuum in Athens, leading to a period of political instability with less capable leaders taking his place. So what was this mysterious disease? For centuries, historians and scientists have debated it. Thucydides' description is incredibly detailed, but it doesn't perfectly match any single disease we know today. Some theories suggest it could have been typhus, which often spreads in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Others have proposed smallpox, measles, or even an early form of Ebola. Recent studies of DNA found in a mass grave from the period have pointed towards typhoid fever, but even this isn't universally accepted. The truth is, we may never know for sure what the plague of Athens really was, but its impact is undeniable. While Athens eventually recovered its population, the psychological and political scars ran deep. The plague severely weakened Athens' ability to fight the war. It drained their manpower, their resources, and their morale. Many historians argue that the plague was a crucial turning point in the Peloponnesian War. Without it, could Athens have won? It's one of history's great what-ifs. The golden age of Athens didn't end overnight, but the plague was a devastating blow from which it never fully recovered its former glory and confidence. The story of the plague of Athens is a powerful reminder of how vulnerable even the most advanced societies can be to disease. It shows how quickly social order can break down in the face of overwhelming fear and death. But it also gives us the incredible account of Thucydides, a testament to the human desire to observe, record, and understand. Even in the midst of chaos, it's a sobering tale from the ancient world that still resonates with us today, reminding us of the fragility of life and civilization. Imagine a world thousands of years ago along the fertile banks of the Nile in ancient Egypt, or between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. Civilizations were blooming, pyramids were reaching for the heavens, and great cities were rising from the dust. But as the sun set each day, a hidden terror emerged from the shimmering waters and lushmar, a terror that brought with it a nightly ritual of suffering. For the farmers who tilled the rich soil and the laborers who built monuments to gods and kings, the evenings were not a time of rest, but of dread. An invisible enemy would strike, bringing a sudden, bone-rattling chill that no blanket could warm. This would be followed by a raging fever, a heat so intense it felt like fire coursing through their veins. Their bodies would ache, their heads would pound, and they would be left drenched in sweat, utterly exhausted. This was their life. A cycle of brief, fragile recovery in the daylight, only to be plunged back into misery as darkness fell. They called it by many names, this nightly fever, but they didn't know its true cause. Was it a curse from a vengeful god? Was it foul air rising from the swamps? They could only see its devastating effects. Strong men and women, the very backbone of these great civilizations, were weakened. Their muscles, once powerful enough to raise stone blocks, became frail. They couldn't work the fields, couldn't tend to their families, couldn't live. Their lives became a blur of sorrow and exhaustion, an endless struggle against an unseen force that drained their strength and their hope. This mysterious illness wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a shadow hanging over society itself, a constant drain on the vitality of an entire people. This, for millennia, was the grim reality of living with malaria. The Greeks later called it pelas, meaning marsh, and air, meaning air, giving us the name we know today, malaria or bad air. The brilliant physician Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, was one of the first to meticulously document its symptoms. He observed the cyclical nature of the fever, some recurring every third day, others every fourth. He linked the disease to the seasons and to living near stagnant water. He didn't know about the mosquito, of course, but his keen observations were a crucial first step in untangling this ancient puzzle. The Roman Empire, with its vast network of roads and aqueducts, also felt the heavy hand of malaria. The Pontine Marshes, a large swampy area near Rome, were infamous as a breeding ground for the disease. The Roman fever, as it was often called, periodically swept through the city, debilitating soldiers and citizens alike. Some historians even argue that malaria played a significant role in the eventual decline of the Western Roman Empire, weakening its population and military to the point where they were more vulnerable to outside threats. It's a sobering thought. A microscopic parasite carried by a tiny insect, helping to topple one of the greatest empires in history. For centuries, the only defense was guesswork and folk remedies. People would burn fragrant woods to purify the air or move to higher ground away from the wetlands. But a real breakthrough wouldn't come until the 17th century, and it arrived from a world away, deep in the forests of South America. Spanish Jesuit missionaries in Peru learned from the indigenous Quechua people about a remarkable tree. The bark of this tree, the cinchona tree, had an incredible power. When ground into a powder and consumed, it could stop the terrifying cycles of fever and chills. This fever tree bark was a miracle. The legend goes that the Countess of Chinchon, the wife of the Spanish viceroy in Peru, was cured of malaria by this bark in the 1630s. In her honor, the botanist Linnaeus later named the tree cinchona. The powdered bark was brought back to Europe, where it became known as Jesuit's powder. It was the first effective treatment for malaria the world had ever known, but it was expensive, often adulterated, and met with suspicion. It took time for its use to become widespread. The active ingredient, the powerful alkaloid quinine, wouldn't be isolated from the bark until 1820 by two French chemists, Pelletier and Cavin. This discovery allowed for standardized doses and made the treatment far more reliable. Quinine became a cornerstone of colonial expansion, allowing Europeans to venture into tropical regions where malaria had previously made survival nearly impossible. Yet, the fundamental question remained: how did people get sick in the first time? The bad air theory persisted for centuries. The real culprit was still hiding in plain sight. The breakthrough came in the late 19th century, a golden age of medical discovery. In 1880, a French army surgeon named Charles-Louis Alphonse Laveran, stationed in Algeria, was examining the blood of a malaria patient under a microscope. He noticed something no one had seen before: tiny, wriggling parasites inside the red blood cells. He had discovered the Plasmodium parasite, the true cause of malaria. For this, he would later win the Nobel Prize. But how did the parasite get into the blood? The final piece of the puzzle was put in place by a British officer in the Indian Medical Service, Ronald Ross. Inspired by the work of another scientist, Patrick Manson, who suspected insects were involved, Ross embarked on a painstaking investigation. For years, he dissected countless mosquitoes under the blistering Indian sun. Finally, in 1897, his persistence paid off. He found the malaria parasites developing inside the stomach of a specific type of mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito that had fed on the malaria patient. He then demonstrated that these mosquitoes could transmit the parasite to healthy birds. The chain of transmission was complete. It wasn't bad air. It was the bite of an infected female Anopheles mosquito. Ross's discovery was monumental. It transformed our understanding of the disease and earned him the Nobel Prize in 1902. He famously wrote a poem after his discovery, ending with the triumphant lines, "I know this little thing. A myriad men will save, O death. Where is thy sting, thy victory, O great?" With the cause and mode of transmission finally understood, the 20th century saw the dawn of a new era in the fight against malaria, the era of control. The strategy was two-pronged: attack the parasite inside the human body and attack the mosquito vector in the environment. The discovery of new anti-malarial drugs was crucial. During World War II, when quinine supplies from Southeast Asia were cut off, the search for synthetic alternatives intensified. This led to the development of chloroquine, a highly effective and inexpensive drug that became the frontline treatment for decades. Later, in the 1970s, Chinese scientists, including Tu Youyu, revisited ancient herbal texts and discovered artemisinin derived from the sweet wormwood plant. This potent compound became the basis for the most effective treatments we have today. Artemisinin-based combination therapies, or AC. Tu Youyu's work earned her a share of the 2015 Nobel Prize in Medicine, a testament to the enduring power of combining ancient wisdom with modern science. On the other front, the war on the mosquito began. This involved draining swamps to eliminate breeding grounds, a practice that dated back centuries but was now pursued with scientific rigor. Screens were put on windows, and people were encouraged to sleep under bed nets. Then came the chemical arsenal. The insecticide DDT was discovered to be incredibly effective at killing mosquitoes. In the mid-20th century, the World Health Organization launched the Global Malaria Eradication Program, relying heavily on spraying DDT inside homes and treating populations with chloroquine. For a time, it seemed like victory was within reach. Malaria was eliminated from Europe, North America, and parts of the Caribbean and Asia. But the campaign ultimately faltered. The parasite developed resistance to chloroquine, and the mosquitoes developed resistance to DDT. The program was also logistically impossible to implement in some of the hardest-hit regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. The dream of global eradication was abandoned in 1969, a major setback in this long war. Today, the fight continues, armed with new tools and a more realistic, integrated approach. Insecticide-treated bed nets are a simple but incredibly effective tool, creating a protective barrier around people while they sleep, the time when Anopheles mosquitoes are most active. Indoor residual spraying with a new generation of insecticides remains a key strategy. Rapid diagnostic tests allow for quick and accurate diagnosis, ensuring that people receive the right treatment promptly. And the science never stops. Researchers are constantly working on new drugs to stay ahead of parasite resistance. And the holy grail of malaria prevention, a vaccine, is finally becoming a reality. After decades of research, the first ever malaria vaccine, RTSS, has been recommended by the WHO and is being rolled out for children in Africa, the continent that bears the heaviest burden of the disease. While its efficacy is partial, it represents a historic milestone and a new beacon of hope. From the fevers of ancient Egypt to the cutting-edge laboratories of the 21st century, the story of malaria is a story of human suffering, resilience, and ingenuity. It's a tale of a tiny parasite that has shaped history, toppled empires, and spurred centuries of scientific discovery. The war is not yet won, but for the first time in our long history with this disease, the path to a malaria-free world, while still challenging, is clearer than ever before. Imagine a world where a single diagnosis could sever every tie you have to your family, your friends, and your community. A world where you are cast out, forced to live in isolation, carrying not just the weight of a disease, but the crushing burden of loneliness for thousands of years. This was the reality for people with leprosy. Our story begins around 1500 BCE in ancient India and the Middle East. It is here we find some of the earliest written accounts of a disease that would haunt humanity for millennia. The Sushruta Samhita, an ancient Sanskrit text on medicine and surgery, describes a condition with symptoms eerily similar to what we now know as leprosy or Hansen's disease. It talks about anesthetic skin patches, deformities, and ulcers. But this wasn't just a medical issue. It was a social death sentence. In many ancient cultures, illness was seen as a divine punishment, a physical manifestation of sin or impurity. Leprosy, with its slow, disfiguring progression, was considered the ultimate curse. Those afflicted were deemed unclean and forced to leave their homes and villages. Picture this. You're walking down a dusty road. You hear a clapper or a bell ringing in the distance. This was a common requirement for people with leprosy. They had to announce their presence, warning others to stay away. They were often forced to shout, "Unclean, unclean." As they approached, the psychological toll of this forced self-denunciation is almost impossible to comprehend. The very words you speak become a barrier, a wall between you and the rest of the world. The isolation was absolute. People with leprosy were forbidden from entering cities or crowded places. They couldn't touch anyone, share a meal, or even drink from the same well. They were pushed to the margins of society, forced to live in segregated colonies, or simply wander as outcasts, begging for scraps of food. The physical suffering from the disease was immense, but for many, the emotional pain of being shunned, of being treated as less than human, was far worse. The humiliation and profound loneliness defined their existence. This stigma wasn't confined to one region. As civilizations interacted and empires expanded, so did the fear of leprosy. The Old Testament, particularly the book of Leviticus, contains detailed laws for identifying and isolating those with tezerath, a term often translated as leprosy. While scholars debate whether this was the same disease we know today, the societal response was identical: complete separation. The afflicted person had to live alone outside the camp. When the Roman Empire rose, its vast network of roads and trade routes unfortunately helped the disease spread across Europe. By the Middle Ages, leprosy was endemic. Fear and misinformation were rampant. It was widely believed to be highly contagious and hereditary, a mark of moral corruption passed down through generations. This created a cycle of despair, where families were torn apart and children were born into a life of ostracism. To manage the perceived crises, Europe saw the rise of leproseria, or leper houses. By the 13th century, there were thousands of these institutions scattered across the continent. While some were run by compassionate religious orders offering care and solace, many were little more than prisons. Once you entered a leprosarium, you were often legally declared dead. A symbolic funeral service would be held, where you would stand in an open grave as dirt was sprinkled over you. You were given a special cloak, a hat, and a dreaded clapper. Your ties to your former life were legally and symbolically severed. You were a ghost, living in the shadow of society. Life inside these colonies was bleak. Overcrowding and poor sanitation were common. Residents were subject to strict rules, and their contact with the outside world was severely limited, often restricted to seeing family through a special window known as a leper squint, built into church walls. These small openings allowed them to observe religious services without mixing with the general congregation, a poignant symbol of their separation. Yet, even in this darkness, there were glimmers of humanity. Figures like Saint Francis of Assisi famously embraced and cared for people with leprosy, challenging the prevailing attitudes of fear and revulsion. Kings and queens like Queen Matilda of Scotland were known to wash the feet of those with the disease, acts of profound humility and compassion that stood in stark contrast to the widespread stigma. These actions, though small, were powerful reminders that beneath the disease were human beings deserving of dignity and love. As Europe moved from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, something strange happened. The prevalence of leprosy began to decline dramatically. Historians and scientists are still not entirely sure why. Some theories suggest that the rise of tuberculosis, another bacterial infection, may have conferred some form of immunity. Others point to improvements in hygiene or a natural shift in the disease's severity. Whatever the reason, by the 16th century, many leproseria had been closed or repurposed, but the fear didn't disappear. It just moved. As European explorers and colonizers traveled the globe, they took the stigma of leprosy with them. In places like Hawaii, the disease arrived with foreigners and spread rapidly among the native population, who had no prior immunity. In 1866, the Hawaiian government established a settlement on the remote Kalaupapa Peninsula on the island of Molokai. It was a natural prison surrounded by 1,000-foot cliffs on one side and the rough Pacific Ocean on the other. Thousands of people, including children, were forcibly taken from their families and exiled to Kalaupapa, most never to return. Letters from this period are heartbreaking, filled with longing for loved ones and despair at their forced isolation. It was here, however, that one of history's most inspiring stories of compassion unfolded. A Belgian priest, Father Damien, volunteered to serve the community in 1873. He didn't just minister to them, he lived with them. He dressed their sores, built homes, organized the community, and, most importantly, restored their sense of dignity. He eventually contracted the disease himself and died on Molokai, a testament to his selfless dedication. His work and that of others, like Mother Marianne Kolb, transformed Kalapapa from a place of despair into a community of resilience. The scientific breakthrough finally came in 1873. The same year Father Damien arrived in Molokai. A Norwegian physician named Gerhard Armaur Hansen peered through his microscope and identified the culprit, a slow-growing bacterium, Mycobacterium leprae. This was a monumental discovery. It proved that leprosy was not a curse or a hereditary taint, but an infectious disease caused by a germ. For the first time, there was a scientific basis for understanding the illness. You might think this discovery would immediately dismantle the centuries of stigma, but fear is a powerful force, and old prejudices die hard. The discovery of a bacterium, in some ways, intensified the fear of contagion. The era of forced isolation continued, and even escalated in many parts of the world. The true revolution in treatment didn't come until the 1940s with the development of sulfone drugs, like Dapsone. For the first time, there was an effective cure, but treatment was long, often lasting for years, and the bacteria could develop resistance. The whole game changer arrived in the 1980s with the introduction of multi-drug therapy, or This combination of 3 antibiotics could cure patients in as little as 6 to 12 months. And crucially, once a person starts MDT, they are no longer infectious within a matter of days. Think about that. A disease that caused millennia of banishment can now be rendered non-contagious almost immediately. The World Health Organization began providing MDT for free to all patients worldwide in 1995. Since then, more than 16 million people have been cured. The number of new cases has plummeted. Leprosy is now a completely curable disease. But the battle is not over. While the medical fight is being won, the social fight against stigma continues. In some communities, the old fears persist. People affected by leprosy and their families still face discrimination in employment, education, and marriage. Laws discriminating against people with leprosy still exist in some countries. The physical scars may heal, but the emotional and social wounds can last a lifetime. Today, organizations and individuals around the world are working to finally end the story of leprosy. They're focused on early detection and treatment to prevent disabilities, and on education to dismantle the lingering stigma. They champion the idea that we should refer to people affected by leprosy, not lepers, to emphasize their humanity over their condition. The long, painful history of leprosy is not just a story about a disease, it's a story about us. It's a mirror reflecting our capacity for both fear and compassion, for cruelty and for kindness. It's a powerful lesson in how misunderstanding can build walls of isolation and how science and empathy can tear them down. The journey from outcast to patient, from curse to cure, has been a long one, but it shows us that even the oldest shadows can be overcome by the light of knowledge and human dignity. Have you ever looked at an old black and white photo and wondered what life was really like back then? Beyond the clothes and the stiff poses, what were people's biggest fears? For much of human history, one of the most terrifying answers to that question was a single word: smallpox. Imagine ancient Egypt around 1100 BCE. The Great Pyramids stand tall, but on the ground, a silent killer is at work. It leaves its mark not just on the living with disfiguring scars, but also on the dead. The mummified remains of Pharaoh Ramses V Chotel on his face, a silent testament to a disease that feared no king. In those days, if your child caught the high fever and the dreaded rash, there was little you could do but pray. Families mourned in silence, not knowing why this plague had come or who it would take next. The fear of contagion was a constant shadow, isolating neighbors and turning communities into places of suspicion. This wasn't just an Egyptian problem. As trade routes and armies spread across the globe, they carried smallpox with them. It arrived in India, where it was so devastating they created a goddess, Shatala Devi, to both bring and cure the disease, hoping to appease her wrath. By the 4th century, it reached China. By the 6th Daga, it had a foothold in Japan and Korea. Imagine a world with no understanding of germs, where a mysterious illness could wipe out a third of your village in a matter of weeks. It was a lottery of life and death. The disease reached Europe with a vengeance. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it became a grim part of life. It didn't care if you were rich or poor. Queen Mary II of England, Emperor Joseph I of Austria, King Louis XV of France fell victim to smallpox. It shaped royal successions and altered the course of history. For common people, it was an ever-present threat, a childhood rite of passage that many did not survive. Those who did were often left with deep pitted scars, known as pockmarks, and sometimes blindness. To survive smallpox was to be marked by it, a visible sign that you had faced death and won. Then came the age of exploration. European ships sailed to the Americas, carrying not just explorers and conquerors, but also an invisible and deadly cargo. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no immunity to old world diseases like smallpox. The result was catastrophic, a demographic collapse unlike anything seen before or since. Entire civilizations like the Aztecs and the Incas were destined. The disease spread faster than any army, weakening empires from within and making conquest tragically easy. It's estimated that in the century after Columbus, up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished, with smallpox as the lead killer. It was a biological weapon, wielded unintentionally, but with devastating effect. For centuries, humanity seemed helpless, but glimmers of hope began to appear, not in fancy European laboratories, but through ancient folk wisdom. In parts of Asia and Africa, people practiced something called the idea was terrifying but brilliant. Take material from a smallpox sore of a person with a mild case and introduce it into a healthy person. This would usually cause a less severe infection, and if you survived, you were immune for life. It was a huge gamble. You were intentionally giving someone a deadly disease, and about 2 to 3% of people who underwent variolation still died. But that was a much better bet than the 30% death rate from catching smallpox naturally. The practice was introduced to Europe in the early 18th century by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. As the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, she saw variolation firsthand in Constantinople. Having survived smallpox herself and lost her brother to it, she was determined to protect her own children. She had her son variolated and brought the practice back to England, championing it among the aristocracy. It was controversial, but it was the best weapon they had. The real breakthrough, however, came from an English country doctor named Edward Jenner. Jenner noticed something fascinating about the dairymaids in his community. They often caught a mild disease from cows called cowpox, which caused sores on their hands. But these same dairymaids rarely, if ever, got smallpox. Jenner had a revolutionary idea. What if cowpox could provide protection against smallpox without the deadly risks of variolation? In 1796, Jenner decided to test his theory. He took material from a cowpox sore on the hand of a dairymaid named Sarah Nelms and inoculated an 8-year-old boy, James Pepys. Weeks later, Jenner exposed James to smallpox. The boy showed no symptoms. He was immune. Jenner called his new method vaccination, from the Latin word for cow, vacca. This was the beginning of the end for smallpox. Jenner's discovery was one of the most important medical advancements in human history. Vaccination was safer, more reliable, and could be administered to everyone. Of course, it wasn't an overnight success. There was skepticism, fear, and anti-vaccination movements even back then. But the results spoke for themselves. As vaccination campaigns slowly spread across the globe over the next century and a half, smallpox began to retreat. The final, decisive battle against this ancient enemy began in 1967. The World Health Organization launched an ambitious, intensified global eradication program. It was a massive undertaking, a coordinated effort involving thousands of health workers in dozens of countries. They used a new, more stable vaccine and a clever strategy called ring vaccination. Instead of trying to vaccinate everyone, they would race to any new outbreak, vaccinate all the contacts of the infected person and the contacts of those contacts, creating a ring of immunity to stop the virus from spreading. It was a grueling, heroic effort. Health workers traveled to the most remote corners of the world, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of Brazil, convincing villagers, navigating conflicts, and battling logistical nightmares. They faced suspicion and cultural barriers, but they persisted. The last naturally occurring case of smallpox was recorded in Somalia in 1977 in a hospital cook named Ali Mayo Malin. He survived. After 2 more years of intense surveillance with no new cases, the world held its breath. Then, on May 8, 1980, the World Health Organization made a historic announcement. Smallpox had been eradicated for the first time in history. Humanity had completely wiped a human disease off the face of the earth. It's a story of fear and loss, but ultimately, it's a story of triumph. It's a testament to human ingenuity, cooperation, and the relentless pursuit of a healthier world. From the silent suffering in ancient Egypt to the global celebration in 1980, the fight against smallpox shows us what we can achieve when we work together. It's a powerful reminder that even our most ancient and terrifying enemies can be defeated. Now, we're journeying back in time, not to witness grand battles or the rise of empires, but to uncover the story of a silent, relentless killer that has haunted humanity for millennia. Imagine a world without antibiotics. A world where a persistent cough could be a death sentence. This is the story of tuberculosis. Our story begins around 1000 BCE in the bustling civilizations of ancient Egypt, the vibrant Indus Valley, and the philosophical heartlands of Greece. Here, a shadow lurked in the corners of society. They called it phthisis in Greece, meaning to waste away. In India, it was the king of diseases, and in Egypt, its telltale signs were etched into the very bones of mummies. It was a slow, insidious disease. It didn't strike with the sudden fury of plague. Instead, it crept into homes and settled in the lungs. The symptoms were heartbreakingly gradual. A person would start to feel tired, a little weaker, than usual. Then came the fever, the night sweats, and a cough that just wouldn't quit. As weeks turned into months, their bodies grew thin, their skin pale and almost translucent. People called it consumption because it seemed to consume its victims from the inside out. In the final, tragic stages, the coughs would bring up blood. Families could only watch, helpless, as their loved ones faded away, trapped in a cycle of sickness and poverty that seemed to have no end. This wasn't just a disease. It was a profound sorrow that settled over entire communities. As we move forward through history, we find tuberculosis weaving its way through the fabric of every society. In the crowded, often unsanitary cities of medieval Europe, it thrived. It was a disease of both the poor, crammed into damp, dark tenements, and the rich, though it was far more prevalent among the less fortunate. The lack of understanding about how diseases spread meant that people lived in close quarters with the sick, sharing beds, food, and the very air they breathed. Each cough was a potential vector, releasing invisible droplets of bacteria into the room, a silent threat to everyone present. The prevailing medical theory of the time was the humoral theory inherited from the ancient Greeks. Doctors believed the body was governed by 4 fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. For consumption, they often blamed an excess of phlegm. Treatments were as ineffective as they were bizarre. They included bloodletting to remove bad blood and prescribing specific diets like drinking large amounts of milk, hoping to nourish the wasting body. Some even recommended a change of air, sending patients to the countryside or the seaside. While fresh air and rest were genuinely beneficial, no one truly understood why. It was a shot in the dark. The Renaissance brought a surge of artistic and scientific inquiry, and with it, a renewed look at the human body. Anatomists, like Andreas Vesalius, began to dissect human bodies, challenging centuries of dogma. However, when it came to tuberculosis, progress was slow. Even as they mapped the organs and circulatory system with newfound accuracy, the microscopic world of bacteria remained invisible and unknown. The disease gained a strange, romanticized reputation during this period. The polyskin flushed cheeks and frail, ethereal appearance of its victims became associated with artistic sensitivity and delicate beauty. Poets and artists were often depicted as suffering from consumption, as if the disease itself fueled their creative genius. But this romantic notion was a cruel facade, masking the grim reality of a painful and drawn-out death. It was until the 17th and 18th centuries that the first real glimmers of understanding began to emerge. In 1679, an anatomist named Franciscus Sylvius was one of the first to describe the characteristic tubercles of the small, hard nodules found in the lungs of TB victims. He made the crucial connection between these nodules and the symptoms of the disease. He recognized that these weren't just random growths, but were a consistent feature of consumption. This was a monumental step. For the first time, tuberculosis was being identified as a specific pathological entity, not just a general wasting away. Then, in 1720, an English physician named Benjamin Martin proposed a radical theory. He suggested that consumption might be caused by wonderfully minute living creatures that could be transmitted from person to person. He was, in essence, describing germs. Over 150 years before the germ theory of disease would be widely accepted. Martin's ideas were revolutionary, but they were largely ignored by the medical establishment of his time. It was too far outside the realm of accepted knowledge. The world wasn't ready for the idea of invisible invaders. The 19th century was the great age of tuberculosis. The Industrial Revolution had drawn millions of people from the countryside into rapidly expanding cities. They lived in overcrowded, poorly ventilated housing with inadequate sanitation and nutrition. These were the perfect breeding grounds for the tubercle bacillus. TB rates skyrocketed, and it became the leading cause of death in Europe and North America. It's estimated that at its peak, tuberculosis was responsible for 1 in every 7 deaths. It was an epidemic in slow motion, touching nearly every family. It was during this time that the sanatorium movement began. Pioneered by physicians like Hermann Bremer in Germany, the idea was to isolate patients in specialized hospitals, usually located in mountainous areas with plenty of fresh, clean air. The treatment regimen was simple: complete bed rest, a highly nutritious diet, and controlled exposure to sunlight and fresh air. This rescue didn't kill the bacteria, but it gave the patient's own immune system the best possible chance to fight back. Sanatoriums became a symbol of hope, a place where one could potentially recover from this dreaded disease. For those who could afford it, it offered a chance. For the poor, however, this level of care was often out of reach. The true breakthrough, the moment that changed everything, came on the evening of March 24th, 1882. In a small, crowded room in Berlin, a German physician named Robert Koch stood before the Physiological Society. He announced that he had isolated and identified the bacterium responsible for tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This was the enemy, finally unmasked. Koch had not only seen the bacillus under his microscope, but he had also grown it in a pure culture and then used that culture to induce the disease in healthy animals, proving its role as the causative agent. This was the culmination of Louis Pasteur's germ theory and the birth of modern bacteriology. The world now knew what caused TB. The next logical step was finding a way to kill it. Knowing the cause, however, did not immediately lead to a cure. The early 20th century saw the development of the BCG vaccine, a live, weakened strain of a related bacterium. It offered some protection, especially against severe forms of TB in children, and it's still used in many parts of the world today. But for those already sick, the rest cure in sanatoriums remained the primary treatment. The search for a magic bullet, a chemical that could kill the bacteria without harming the patient, was on. Then, in the midst of World War II, another breakthrough occurred. In 1943, a microbiologist named Selman Waxman and his team at Rutgers University were systematically screening soil microbes for antibiotic properties. One of his graduate students, Albert Chichetz, isolated a new antibiotic from a soil fungus. They called it streptomycin. In 1944, it was given to a young woman who was dying of advanced tuberculosis. Miraculously, she recovered. It was the first effective antibiotic against TB. The age of consumption was finally drawing to a close. Soon after, other drugs, like isoniazid and pyrazinamide, were discovered, and it became clear that a combination of these drugs was the most effective way to treat TB and prevent the bacteria from developing resistance. By the 1950s and 60s, with the advent of multi-drug therapy, sanatoriums began to close. What was once a year-long, uncertain battle in a mountain hospital could now be treated with a course of pills. For the developed world, it seemed like tuberculosis was on the verge of being conquered, a relic of a bygone era. But the story doesn't end there. While TB rates plummeted in wealthy nations, it continued to be a major killer in developing countries, where access to diagnosis and treatment was limited. And then, in the 1980s, something happened that allowed this ancient foe to re-emerge with a vengeance: the HIV/AIDS epidemic. HIV weakens the immune system, making a person highly susceptible to a latent TB infection. Becoming inactive life-threatening disease. TB became the #1 killer of people with HIV. At the same time, new, terrifying strains of multidrug-resistant tuberculosis, or MDR-TB, began to appear, a direct result of incomplete or improper treatment. These strains were resistant to the most powerful first-line drugs, making them incredibly difficult and expensive to treat. Today, tuberculosis is still one of the world's deadliest infectious diseases, claiming over 1 million lives every year. It remains a disease of poverty, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable populations. But there is hope. Global efforts to fight TB are stronger than ever. Researchers are working on new vaccines, faster diagnostics, and better drug regimens to combat drug-resistant strains. The story of tuberculosis is a powerful reminder of our long and complex relationship with the microbial world. It's a story of suffering and sorrow, but also one of scientific triumph, resilience, and the enduring human spirit in the face of a relentless adversary. Step back in time with me to the 6th century BCE, a world we often imagine filled with philosophers in white robes and magnificent marble temples gleaming under a Mediterranean sun. This was the dawn of Western civilization, the age of Sparta's warriors in Athens, burgeoning democracy. But beneath this veneer of glory, in the bustling, crowded heart of the Greek city-states, a silent, unseen enemy was gathering its strength. An enemy that didn't carry a spear or a shield, but brought death all the same. Imagine the streets of a city like Athens or Corinth. They weren't the pristine avenues we see in movies. They were narrow, winding, and teeming with life. People, animals, and waste all shared the same space. The concept of sanitation, as we know it, was centuries away. Water, the very source of life, was often drawn from wells and fountains that could easily become contaminated. It was in this environment, a perfect storm of progress and pollution, that a devastating illness began to take hold. Typhoid fever. They wouldn't have called it typhoid, of course. To the ancient Greeks, it was simply a asterisk, loimos asterisk, a plague, a pestilence sent by displeased gods. It started subtly, a headache, a feeling of weakness. Then the fever would begin to climb, a relentless heat that burned from within. Day after day, the temperature would rise, leaving its victims delirious, weak, and tormented. A characteristic rash, like pale rose petals, might bloom across the torso, a grim sign of the disease's progression. But the most terrifying symptoms were in the gut. Severe abdominal pain, followed by relentless diarrhea or, for some, a debilitating constipation. The body, already weakened by fever, was now being ravaged from the inside out. Dehydration was a constant threat. People would waste away, their strength seeping from them with every passing hour. In a world without intravenous fluids or antibiotics, this was often a death sentence. Picture the scene in a typical Greek home. A family member, perhaps a strong father or a young child, lies on a simple cot, their skin hot to the touch, their eyes glazed over with fever. The family would be frantic, desperate. They would pray to Apollo, the god of healing, or his son, as they might make offerings at the temple begging for divine intervention. Healers, the early physicians of the time, would do what they could. They might recommend cool baths to fight the fever, or offer herbal concoctions made from plants believed to have cooling properties. They understood the importance of rest and tried to encourage the patient to drink, but their knowledge was limited. They were fighting a microscopic enemy with macroscopic tools. As the illness spread, fear would have gripped the city. The fever didn't discriminate. It struck the rich in their spacious villas and the poor in their cramped tenements. It took soldiers, merchants, mothers, and children. The normal rhythms of life would grind to a halt. The Basilinha Agora, the marketplace, would grow quiet. People would become suspicious of their neighbors, avoiding contact, isolating themselves in their homes, hoping the plague would pass them by. Each new funeral pyre, sending smoke into the sky, was a stark reminder of their shared vulnerability. For those who did survive, the ordeal was far from over. Recovery was a long, slow process. They would be left emaciated and profoundly weak, taking weeks, even months, to regain their former strength. And here's a crucial, invisible danger. Some survivors became carriers. They felt perfectly healthy, but they continued to carry the Salmonella typhi bacteria in their bodies, unknowingly shedding it and capable of infecting others. This is how the cycle continued, a ghost in the community, sparking new outbreaks when conditions were right. Think of the famous Typhoid Mary from the 20th century. She had ancient predecessors, nameless figures who inadvertently spread sickness and death. This constant battle against unseen diseases like typhoid shaped the ancient world in profound ways. It drove the first real inquiries into public health and medicine. Thinkers like Hippocrates, who would emerge a century later, began to shift the focus away from divine punishment and towards environmental factors. He and his followers started observing that diseases were more common in certain places and under certain conditions, like near stagnant water or in overcrowded areas. They started to connect the dots between environment and health. This was a revolutionary idea, the birth of rational medicine. The suffering caused by typhoid and other fevers was a catalyst, pushing humanity to look for answers, not just in the heavens, but in the world around them. The despair of 6th century BCE Greece in the face of this fever was immense. They were surrounded by death, helpless against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. Yet, it was in this darkness that the first sparks of medical science were truly ignited. The struggle for survival forced them to observe, to reason, and to question. It reminds us that so much of our modern medical knowledge, the knowledge that keeps us safe from diseases like typhoid today, is built upon a foundation of ancient sorrow and a desperate, determined search for answers. The ghosts of these ancient victims are a testament to how far we've come. Now, we're journeying back in time, not to witness grand battles or the rise of them, but to uncover a silent, relentless enemy that has plagued humanity since the dawn of civilization. We're talking about a disease that has shaped history in ways you might not expect. Dysentery. Our story begins around 2500 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, the land of the Sumerians. Imagine bustling cities like Ur and Uruk with their towering ziggurats and revolutionary inventions like writing and the wheel. Life was advancing, but beneath this veneer of progress, a hidden threat lurked in the water, in the food, and in the crowded living conditions. This is where we first find clear evidence of dysentery, a brutal intestinal infection causing severe diarrhea, fever, and abdominal pain. For the Sumerians, who relied on shared water sources like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, an outbreak could spread like wildfire. A single contaminated water source could bring a neighborhood to its knees. Sumerian medical texts, inscribed on clay tablets, describe illnesses with symptoms strikingly similar to They attributed these afflictions to demons or the wrath of the gods, and their treatments were a mix of ritual and herbal remedies. While they lacked the understanding of germs we have today, their detailed observations give us the first glimpse into humanity's long and arduous battle with this disease. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. A widespread outbreak could weaken a city-state's workforce and army, leaving it vulnerable to rivals. In this era, sickness and survival were deeply intertwined, and dysentery was a formidable foe. Fast forward a couple of thousand years, and we arrive at the mighty Roman Empire. Rome was a marvel of engineering, with aqueducts that carried fresh water for miles and complex sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima. You'd think this would have solved the problem, right? Well, not exactly. While these innovations were revolutionary, they weren't perfect. The aqueducts provided cleaner water for the wealthy, but the vast majority of Rome's 1 million inhabitants still relied on the Tiber River or public fountains of questionable cleanliness. Furthermore, Roman cities were incredibly dense. People lived in tightly packed apartment blocks called insulae, where sanitation was often abysmal. Waste was commonly thrown out of windows onto the streets below. Public latrines, while a novel idea, were often poorly maintained and became breeding grounds for bacteria. In this environment, dysentery thrived. Roman physicians like Galen and Celsus wrote extensively about fluxes of the bowel, detailing the debilitating effects of the disease. They understood it was often linked to diet and environment, but without germ theory. Their treatments were limited to dietary changes, astringents, and rest. The real impact of dysentery, however, was felt most acutely in the Roman legions. These formidable armies were constantly on the move, setting up temporary camps across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Imagine thousands of soldiers living in close quarters, often with unreliable water sources and rudimentary sanitation. An outbreak of dysentery in a military camp could be more devastating than a battle. It could incapacitate hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers, turning a powerful fighting force into a field hospital. Historians believe that dysentery played a significant role in several military campaigns, weakening armies and sometimes even forcing retreats. The strength of the mighty Roman army could be undone not by a barbarian horde, but by an invisible microbe. As the Roman Empire waned and the medieval period began, the problem didn't go away. In fact, in some ways, it got worse. The sophisticated sanitation systems of the Romans failed into disrepair. Cities became crowded, filthy, and perfect incubators for disease. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, became a constant companion of medieval life, from the humble peasant's village to the besieged castle. During times of famine, when people were malnourished and their immune systems weakened, dysentery outbreaks were particularly lethal. During the numerous wars of the period, like the Crusades or the 100 Years' War, dysentery was a constant threat in military camps, often claiming more lives than combat. Chronicles from the time are filled with harrowing accounts. Entire villages could be decimated. Sieges were often won or lost based on which side succumbed to disease first. Inside a besieged castle, with food and water running low and sanitation non-existent, an outbreak of dysentery was a death sentence. It was a great leveler, affecting kings and commoners alike. King John of England, famous from the Robin Hood legends, is believed to have died from dysentery in 1216. It was a brutal, ever-present reality that shaped the demographics, politics, and warfare of the entire era. The age of exploration, starting in the 5th century, took dysentery global as European ships set sail for the Americas, Africa, and Asia. They carried more than just sailors and supplies. They carried diseases. The long sea voyages were brutal. On board, hundreds of men were crammed into tight, unsanitary spaces. Food was often spoiled, and the water, stored in wooden casks for months, became a breeding ground for bacteria. Dysentery ran rampant on these ships. a condition sailors grimly accepted as part of the journey. The mortality rate on some voyages was staggering, with a significant portion of deaths attributed to the bloody flux. When these ships arrived in the New World, the consequences were catastrophic. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity to many European diseases, including the bacteria that caused dysentery. The introduction of these new pathogens as part of what is known as the Columbian Exchange led to devastating epidemics that wiped out an estimated 90% of the indigenous population. While smallpox is often cited as the main culprit, dysentery was a major contributor to this demographic collapse. It swept through communities with terrifying speed and lethality, fundamentally and tragically altering the course of history on 2 continents. It wasn't until the 19th century that we finally started to understand our ancient enemy. The breakthrough came with the development of germ theory by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. For the first time, we could see the invisible world of microbes. In 1897, a Japanese scientist named Kiyoshi Shiga was investigating a severe dysentery outbreak in Japan. He meticulously studied samples from patients and succeeded in isolating the bacterium responsible. Shigella, he proved that this specific microbe was the cause of the epidemic form of the disease. This discovery was monumental. It transformed dysentery from a mysterious affliction or divine punishment into a solvable medical problem. Knowing the cause was the first critical step toward finding a cure and, more importantly, preventing it. With the identification of the bacteria, the focus shifted to public health. The work of pioneers like John Snow, who traced a cholera outbreak in London to a contaminated water pump, highlighted the critical importance of clean water and sanitation. Cities began investing in modern sewer systems, water treatment plants, and public hygiene initiatives. This sanitary revolution had a dramatic impact on public health. Rates of waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid plummeted in developed countries. It's a change that we largely take for granted today, but it was one of the most significant life-saving advancements in human history. Clean water and effective sanitation have saved more lives than any single medicine. However, the story of dysentery is far from over. While it has become rare in wealthy nations, it remains a serious threat in many parts of the developing world, especially in areas lacking access to clean water, sanitation, and healthcare. It is a major cause of death among young children, particularly in regions affected by poverty, conflict, or natural disasters. Outbreaks are common in refugee camps and communities displaced by war, where overcrowding and poor sanitation create the perfect storm for the disease to spread. Modern medicine has given us antibiotics to treat dysentery, but the rise of antibiotic-resistant strains of Shigella presents a new and alarming challenge. Humanity's 4,500-year war with dysentery is a powerful reminder of the delicate balance between civilization and disease, from the clay tablets of Samaria to modern-day refugee camps. This illness has been a constant, brutal presence. It has toppled armies, shaped empires, and claimed countless lives. Our progress against it is a testament to the power of scientific discovery and public health, but its persistence in vulnerable communities is a stark reminder that our work is not done. The fight for global health, for clean water, and for basic sanitation for every single person on this planet continues. The history of dysentery teaches us that the health of one is tied to the health of all. Ever feel that sudden chill, the ache in your bones, the fever that lays you low? We call it the flu, a seasonal nuisance. But what if I told you that this familiar foe is an ancient enemy, one that has stalked humanity for thousands of years? Our story begins not with a modern lab or a recent outbreak, but in the midst of time, around 1000 BC in ancient China and the Far East. Imagine a world without modern medicine, without even the concept of a virus. As winter's cold grip tightened, a mysterious illness swept through communities. People fell in groups, struck by sudden, high fevers and a terrifying breathlessness. It wasn't just a cough or a cold. It was a swift, invisible predator. In the heart of winter, death and fear spread like wildfire from house to house. Sorrow became a constant companion in every home as families watched their loved ones succumb to an enemy they could unsee or understand. They called it by many names, but the experience was universal. A sudden, overwhelming sickness that seemed to come from nowhere and left devastation in its wake. This was humanity's first recorded encounter with what we now know as influenza. For centuries, this pattern repeated across the globe. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, the father of medicine, described a similar outbreak in 412 BCE. He noted a kapha parenthis, an epidemic that caused sore throats, coughs, and pneumonia, often proving fatal for the elderly. He meticulously documented the symptoms, the rapid spread, and the seasonality of the illness, linking it to the cold, damp conditions of winter. Yet, despite his brilliant observations, the cause remained a complete mystery. Was it bad air, an imbalance of the body's humors, divine punishment without the knowledge of germs? These were the best explanations they had. These early accounts paint a chilling picture of our ancestors' helplessness against a recurring, invisible threat. Fast forward to the Middle Ages in Europe. The world was becoming more connected through trade, pilgrimage, and unfortunately, war. And with this newfound connectivity, the mysterious illness found new highways to travel. In 1580, one of the first truly global pandemics, swept across the known world. It started in Asia, blazed across Africa, and then tore through Europe with incredible speed. Within just 6 months, it had infected nearly the entire continent. In Rome, it was reported that over 8,000 people died. In some Spanish cities, entire populations were wiped out. It was during this era that the illness earned its modern name. In 15th century Italy, they called it influenza, short for influenza di freddo, meaning influence of the cold. Others believed it was influenza di stelle, the influence of the stars. Blaming the alignment of celestial bodies for the widespread sickness, the name influenza stuck, a poetic and slightly mystical label for a disease that seemed to appear and disappear with the whims of nature or the cosmos. It perfectly captured the feeling of being under the influence of some powerful, unseen force. Throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, influenza pandemics continued to erupt every 10 to 30 years, like a ticking clock. Each one had its own character, its own level of severity, but the pattern was consistent. A rapid, global spread that overwhelmed communities and left a trail of mortality. The 1889 to 1890 pandemic, often called the Asiatic flu or Russian flu, was the first to be tracked in near real time thanks to the telegraph and a more globalized press. It started in Central Asia, spread to Russia, and then, riding the new networks of railways and steamships, it encircled the globe in a matter of months. This pandemic was notable because it hits young adults particularly hard, a frightening departure from the usual pattern of affecting the very young and very old. It caused not just respiratory symptoms, but also intense neurological and psychological effects, what was then called nervous prostration. People reported deep depression and fatigue that lingered for months after the fever broke. The world was more connected than ever, And for the first time, people could read daily updates about the virus's relentless march across continents, creating a global sense of shared anxiety and vulnerability. An estimated 1 million people perished worldwide. Yet, even with all this new technology and information, the fundamental question remained unanswered. What was causing it? The turn of the 20th century brought the dawn of modern microbiology. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch had proven that tiny, invisible organisms, bacteria, could cause diseases like anthrax and tuberculosis. So, when a new, terrifying pandemic emerged in 1918, the world's leading scientists were confident they could find the culprit. They were looking for a bacterium, but the 1918 pandemic was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It wasn't just influenza. It was a supercharged, hyperlethal version. It spread with terrifying speed, overwhelming hospitals, and shutting down entire cities. It was nicknamed the Spanish flu, not because it started in Spain, but because Spain, being neutral in World War I, had a free press that reported on the outbreak's severity, while other countries suppressed the news to maintain wartime morale. The most terrifying aspect of the 1918 flu was who it killed. It didn't just target the weak, it struck down the young and healthy in the prime of their lives. A person could feel fine in the morning, develop a fever and cough by noon, and be dead by nightfall, their lungs filled with fluid. Scientists frantically searched for the bacterial cause, isolating various strains from patients, but nothing fit. The true killer was too small, too elusive to be seen with the microscopes of the day. It wasn't a bacterium at all. It was a virus. The 1918 pandemic infected an estimated 500 million people, about a third of the world's population. At the time, and killed between 50 and 100 million. It claimed more lives in a single year than World War I did in 4. It was a demographic catastrophe that left an indelible scar on the human psyche, a humbling reminder of nature's power. And in its wake, it left a crucial scientific mystery. The failure to identify the agent of the 1918 flu spurred a new generation of researchers to look beyond bacteria into the submicroscopic world of viruses. It wasn't until 1933, a full 15 years after the Great Pandemic, that scientists in the UK finally isolated the influenza virus from ferrets. It was a monumental breakthrough. At last, the invisible enemy that had plagued humanity for millennia had a name and a face, albeit one only visible under an electron microscope. This discovery opened the door to understanding how the virus worked, how it spread, and most importantly, how we might fight it. With the virus identified, the race was on to create a vaccine. The first flu vaccines were developed and used on military personnel during World War II in the 1940s. This was a turning point. For the first time in history, we had a specific tool to defend ourselves against this ancient foe. We could prepare for its seasonal return. However, the influenza virus had another trick up its sleeve. Scientists soon discovered that it was a master of disguise, constantly changing its genetic structure. This is why we have new flu pandemics, like the Asian flu of 1957 and the Hong Kong flu of 1968. These were caused by new strains of the virus that the population had no immunity against. It's also why we need a new flu shot every year. The vaccine that protected you last winter might not work against the strain that's circulating this year. This ongoing evolutionary arms race brings us to the present day. We have a global surveillance network that tracks new flu strains. We have advanced vaccine technology, and we have antiviral medications. We understand the influenza virus better than ever before, but the threat remains. The story of influenza From the mysterious fevers of ancient China to the modern science of virology is a powerful saga. It's a story of fear and loss, but also of human ingenuity, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. It reminds us that we are part of a long, ongoing battle against an ever-changing virus. And understanding this history is our best defense for the future. Imagine a world 3,500 years ago. Deep within the lush forests of Africa, a silent killer was born, a disease we now call yellow fever. For centuries, it lurked, a mysterious affliction that brought terror and suffering. Its name came from the haunting jaundice that turned its victim's skin and eyes a ghostly yellow. It was a terrifying enigma, an invisible enemy that took countless lives and left communities shattered in its wake. But this is not just a story of a disease. It's a story of human resilience, scientific discovery, and the relentless fight for survival. Join us as we unravel the epic tale of yellow fever from its ancient origins to the front lines of modern medicine. The first written accounts of what many historians believe to be yellow fever date back to the 17th century, but its roots in Africa are far, far older. Around 1500 BCE, the virus was quietly circulating among monkeys in the jungle canopy. It was a part of the natural cycle, transmitted between primates by a specific type of mosquito. For humans, it was a distant threat, an isolated jungle disease. But as human populations grew and ventured deeper into these forests, the worlds of monkeys, mosquitoes, and people began to collide. A single mosquito bite was all it took to bridge the gap for the virus to leap from its animal host into a human one. When the virus first entered human populations, it was devastating. People had no immunity, no understanding of what was happening. They only knew that a terrible sickness was spreading. It started innocently enough, with a fever, chills, and body aches, much like the flu. But then it would take a sinister turn. After a few days of apparent recovery, a second, more toxic phase would begin. The fever would return, higher this time. The liver would start to fail, causing the characteristic yellowing of the skin and eyes. Internal bleeding would begin, leading to the terrifying symptom of black vomit, partially digested blood. In these early outbreaks, mortality rates were staggeringly high. Without any medical understanding, people relied on traditional remedies and prayers. But the invisible enemy was relentless. It was a time of immense fear and loss, etching a deep scar into the collective memory of the affected communities. Those who managed to survive were lucky. They were granted lifelong immunity, a permanent shield against the yellow jack. The story of yellow fever took a dramatic global turn with the dawn of the age of sail and the transatlantic slave trade. As ships crisscrossed the Atlantic, they didn't just carry people and goods. They carried disease. The Aedes aegypti mosquito, the primary vector for yellow fever, found a new home in the water barrels and holds of these vessels. It was a perfect breeding ground. When these ships, carrying both infected humans and mosquitoes, arrived in the Americas and the Caribbean, they unleashed a biological time bomb. The virus found a new, immunologically naive population, and the results were catastrophic. Major port cities like Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Havana became hotspots for devastating epidemics. In 1793, a massive yellow fever outbreak struck Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States. Panic gripped the city. It's estimated that 10% of the population perished. People fled in droves, abandoning their homes and businesses. The city's social fabric frayed as fear and suspicion replaced community spirit. Doctors of the era were helpless. Their treatments, like bloodletting, often doing more harm than good. They debated endlessly about the cause. Was it bader or miasma, rising from rotin mater, or was it contagious, passed from person to person? No one suspected the tiny, buzzing culprit that was silently orchestrating the entire disaster. For centuries, the true nature of yellow fever remained a mystery. It was until the late 19th century that the pieces Jungju of the puzzle started to fall into place. The breakthrough came from a Cuban doctor and scientist named Carlos Finley. In 1881, he was the first to propose the radical theory that a specific mosquito was responsible for transmitting the disease. He meticulously conducted experiments trying to prove his hypothesis, but for nearly 20 years, his ideas were largely ignored by the international scientific community. They dismissed him, clinging to the old theories of miasma. It was a frustrating and lonely fight for Finley, a visionary ahead of his time. The turning point came during the Spanish-American War. American soldiers stationed in Cuba were dying in huge numbers, not from battle, but from yellow fever and other tropical diseases. The U.S. government established the Yellow Fever Commission, led by Army Major Walter Reed. Initially skeptical of Finley's mosquito theory, Reed and his team, including doctors Jesse Lazier, James Carroll, and Aristides Agramonte, decided to put it to the ultimate test. They designed a series of brave and incredibly dangerous human experiments. In one famous test, volunteers slept in a cabin filled with the soiled bedding and clothing of yellow fever patients to see if the disease was contagious through contact. None of them got sick. In another, a brave volunteer, a soldier named John Moran, allowed himself to be bitten by mosquitoes that had previously fed on infected patients. He contracted yellow fever, but thankfully, he survived. Tragically, one of the researchers, Dr. Jesse Lazier, died from the disease after being accidentally bitten during his research, a true martyr to science. These courageous experiments definitively proved Carlos Finley's theory. The Aedes aegypti mosquito was the vector. This discovery was a monumental game-changer. It transformed yellow fever from a mysterious, unstoppable plague into a preventable disease. The new enemy wasn't some invisible vapor. It was a mosquito. And mosquitoes could be fought. This knowledge armed public health officials with a powerful new weapon. Vector control efforts were launched to eradicate mosquito breeding grounds. This meant covering water containers, draining swamps, and fumigating homes. One of the most stunning successes of this new approach was during the construction of the Panama Canal. The French had previously abandoned their attempt to build the canal, defeated in large part by yellow fever and malaria, which had claimed over 20,000 lives. When the Americans took over, their chief sanitary officer, William C. Gorgas, implemented a massive, aggressive mosquito control campaign based on Reed's findings. It was a war on mosquitoes, and it worked. They dramatically reduced the incidence of yellow fever, paving the way for the successful completion of one of the greatest engineering feats in human history. The final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate weapon against yellow fever, arrived in the 1930s. A scientist named Max Theiler, working at the Rockefeller Foundation, dedicated himself to developing a vaccine. After years of painstaking research, cultivating the virus through chicken embryos to weaken it, he succeeded. He created the 17D vaccine, a remarkably safe and effective vaccine that provides lifelong immunity with a single dose. For this incredible achievement, Max Theiler was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1951. His work has saved countless millions of lives and remains the cornerstone of yellow fever prevention to this day. Today, thanks to the vaccine and effective mosquito control, yellow fever has been largely contained. Large-scale urban epidemics are a thing of the past. However, the virus has not been eradicated. It still circulates in its natural jungle cycle in parts of Africa and South America, posing a constant threat of spillover into human populations. Outbreaks still occur, especially in areas with low vaccination coverage. That's why international health organizations and local governments remain vigilant, conducting vaccination campaigns and monitoring for any signs of an outbreak. The fight that began thousands of years ago in an African forest continues. It's a testament to the power of science, the courage of The story of yellow fever is a powerful reminder of how far we've come and the importance of remaining one step ahead of the invisible enemies that share our world. Imagine a fear so profound it makes you terrified of the very thing you need most to survive: water. This wasn't a horror movie plot. It was the grim reality for countless people throughout history. Picture this: a thriving village in ancient India. Around 500 BCE life. Homes along the banks of a sacred river. The source of life, spirituality, and daily sustenance. Then, suddenly, a silent, invisible terror creeps into the water. One by one, people fall ill with a terrifying sickness. It comes on with shocking speed, leaving its victims weak and dehydrated in a matter of hours. Within days, the once bustling village is transformed into a ghost town. Homes are shuttered, not because people have left, but because they are gone. The air, once filled with the sounds of laughter and commerce, is now heavy with the silence of collective mourning. This wasn't a mythical curse. It was one of the earliest recorded encounters with a disease we now know as cholera. Now, we're journeying back in time to uncover the story of one of humanity's most persistent and devastating adversaries. This is the story of cholera, a disease that has shaped civilizations, sparked scientific revolutions, and continues to challenge us to this day. Our story begins in the Indian subcontinent, specifically in the Ganges Delta. For centuries, cholera was endemic to this region. Early texts, like those from the physician Sushruta, describe an illness with symptoms strikingly similar to cholera. It was a local terror, a seasonal affliction that communities learned to dread. The cause was a mystery, often attributed to miasma or bad air or the wrath of the gods. Villagers would pray, make offerings, and flee. But the disease remained a lurking predator in the water. Forma legna cholera was largely contained within this geographical area. But in the 19th century, something changed. The world was shrinking. Advances in trade, travel, and warfare were connecting continents like never before, and as people moved, so did the disease. The year is 1817. A new, more virulent strain of cholera emerges from the Ganges Delta. Carried by British troops and traders, it explodes out of India, triggering the first of 7 global cholera pandemics. This wasn't a slow creep. It was a tidal wave of disease that would wash over Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Imagine the shock and terror in cities that had never seen anything like it. In places like Muscat and Tehran, the disease arrived with trade caravans, leaving a trail of death in its wake. It moved faster than news could travel. By the time it reached Russia in the 1820s, the continent was gripped by panic. The Asiatic cholera, as it was called, was an alien invader, and no one knew how to stop it. The disease was brutal and indiscriminate. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, young or old. The symptoms were horrifying. A person could be healthy in the morning and gone by nightfall. The rapid loss of fluids was so extreme that it was said the bodies of victims would shrink and turn a bluish-gray color, earning cholera the terrifying nickname, the Blue Death. When cholera finally hit the industrial cities of Europe, like Paris and London, it found the perfect breeding ground. These cities were booming, but they were also incredibly unsanitary. People were packed into overcrowded slums. There were no modern sewage systems. Waste from homes and factories was often dumped directly into the same rivers that supplied drinking water, like the Thames in London. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The pandemic of 1832 was particularly devastating in London. The city was a labyrinth of filth. The prevailing scientific theory at the time was still the miasma theory. That disease was spread by foul-smelling air. It seemed logical. The poorest, most crowded parts of the city smelled the worst and had the highest death rates. So, the authorities focused on cleaning up smells, burning tar barrels in the streets, and dousing everything in vinegar, all to no avail. The death toll continued to climb. This is where our story takes a turn, thanks to a determined and methodical physician named John Snow. Snow was a skeptic of the miasma theory. He observed that cholera was a disease of the gut, not the lungs. It didn't make sense to him that it would be transmitted through the air. He suspected the water. But in a time when everyone believed in miasma, his idea was revolutionary and even a bit absurd to his peers. His moment to prove it came during another major outbreak in London in 1854. In the Soho district, cholera erupted with terrifying ferocity. Hundreds of people died within a few city blocks in just a matter of days. While others panicked, John Snow got to work. He didn't just treat patients. He became a detective. He went door to door, creating a map of the outbreak. He marked every death with a black bar on a street map. A clear pattern began to emerge. The deaths were clustered around a specific public water pump on Broad Street. Snow's investigation was meticulous. He found that workers at a nearby brewery who drank beer instead of water were largely spared. He tracked down the case of a woman who had died of cholera miles away and learned that she had water from the Broad Street pump delivered to her daily because she liked the taste. The evidence was overwhelming. Snow took his map and his data to the local authorities and convinced them to take the handle off the Broad Street pump. It was a simple, decisive action, and almost immediately, the outbreak in Soho subsided. John Snow had effectively proven that cholera was a waterborne disease. His work, however, was not immediately accepted by the scientific establishment. It took years and further evidence for the miasma theory to finally be abandoned. One of the most compelling pieces of that evidence came from another unlikely source, an Italian scientist named Filippo Pacini. In that same year, 1854, Pacini was one of the first to identify the culprit under a microscope, a coma-shaped bacterium he called V. Tragically, his discovery was largely ignored for decades. It wasn't until Robert Koch, a more famous German physician, independently identified this same bacterium in 1883 that the world finally accepted the true cause of cholera vibrioche. The combination of Snow's epidemiology and Koch's microbiology was a game changer. It ushered in a new era of public health. If cholera was in the water, the solution was clear: clean water and proper sanitation. This realization sparked the Great Sanitary Awakening. Cities across the world began the massive, expensive, and life-saving work of building modern water and sewer systems. Separating drinking water from human waste became the cornerstone of modern urban planning. These engineering marvels, hidden beneath our streets, are the direct legacy of the fight against cholera. The fight wasn't over, though. The 20th century saw fewer global pandemics, but cholera remained a threat, especially in areas affected by poverty, war, and natural disasters. Wherever sanitation systems break down, cholera can return with a vengeance. A major breakthrough in treatment came in the 1960s with the development of oral rehydration therapy, or ORT. This wasn't a complex drug, but a simple, inexpensive solution of salt, sugar, and clean water. This solution helps the body reabsorb fluids and electrolytes, directly counteracting the severe dehydration that makes cholera so deadly. ORT is considered one of the most important medical advances of the 20th century. It's easy to administer and has saved millions of lives, reducing the mortality rate of cholera from over 50% to less than 1%. Today, the seventh cholera pandemic, which began in 1961, is still technically ongoing. We see outbreaks in places like Haiti after the 2010 earthquake or in Yemen amidst civil war. It serves as a stark reminder that health is inseparable from infrastructure, stability, and equality. The story of cholera is more than just the story of a bacterium. It's a story about a fear of water turning into a scientific quest for knowledge. It's a story of how a devastating disease forced us to rethink how we live together in cities and led to one of the greatest public health triumphs in human history. It shows us that the invisible systems beneath our feet, our water pipes and sewer lines are just as vital as the hospitals and clinics above ground. The battle that started in an ancient Indian village continues today not just in laboratories but in the global effort to ensure that everyone, everywhere has access to the most fundamental requirement for a healthy life, a safe, clean drink of water.